Welcome back. The increasing surge of biking during the pandemic has also brought some startling stats. In 2020, the Bronx saw the biggest increase in pedestrian and cyclist deaths. In an effort to make our streets safer for cyclists and pedestrians alike, Transportation Alternatives is proposing a challenge to put our street space to better use under the NYC 25 by 25 vision. Joining us now to discuss this and more is Erwin Figueroa, Director of Organizing at Transportation Alternatives. Welcome, Erwin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invite.
Of course. So as we discussed, as we mentioned in the introduction, according to data collected by Transportation Alternatives, the Bronx saw the biggest increase in pedestrian and cyclist deaths last year. Can you share more on this and help us understand why this trend rose so significantly last year?
Yeah, so what we saw last year was unfortunately a combination of problems that we had in the city. First, of course, we had the pandemic, and that disrupted the how traffic moved in the city in major way. One, we had an increase of people driving. With the start of the pandemic, there was a call for people to try to avoid public transit. New York City as a whole, the majority of people commute via public transit, especially in the Bronx, has one of the highest riderships of public transit, both on buses and subway. And then also as well, we saw for those that were also trying to avoid public transit, they couldn't afford a car, were biking. So we saw an increase of people biking, and the numbers were reflected on the bridges. The counters were much higher than in previous years for people biking. That, along with the lack of infrastructure in the Bronx specifically, has led to what we saw last year, a high increase of fatalities with cyclists. The Bronx has unfortunately one of the least amounts of protected bike lanes in the entire city, where Manhattan has more than half of them in the entire city. The Bronx has about 4 to 5% of protected bike lanes of all the mileage in the city. So it's really a combination of more cyclists on the streets, less traffic, which allows cars to go faster, and then also no safe infrastructure for cyclists to be able to bike safely.
Right. Thank you, Erwin. And when you talk about that infrastructure in the Bronx, can you break down what some of those factors are or those safety hazards are for cyclists, particularly here in our borough?
Yeah. So for cyclists, the most important thing that brings to safety is having a clear lane that has no obstructions. And unfortunately, in the Bronx, as I mentioned before, when I talk about protected bike lanes, what I'm talking about is bike lanes that make it either extremely difficult or impossible for a vehicle to be able to park, to block, or to drive through that bike lane. We see a lot of bike lanes in the Bronx that are just literally just paint on the ground, where there's a lane painted right next to a parking lane, which puts cyclists in the line of a car door opening, or you have drivers that double park and they're blocking that painted lane, which forces cyclists to go into a travel lane. And that's what a lot of the crashes are happening when cars are going, when cyclists are going from a bike lane into the general lane. That's where the conflict is happening, and that's where the biggest safety hazard for cyclists is.
TA recently also released data on the dangers that SUVs pose to cyclists. Can you share more on this data, Erwin?
Yeah. So for a very long time, there's been in terms of safety, the safety ratings that we have for vehicles have been focused on the safety of the passengers inside the vehicle. Mm-hmm. Yet, a lot of the fatalities that we're seeing in New York City streets, and just as a whole, as a country, are based on traffic violence, what we call it, which is like cars, drivers crashing their vehicles, and that impacts either other drivers, motorists, cyclists, or pedestrians. And we've seen an increase of the amount of SUV purchases in our streets, and that's you don't even have to look at the stats. You can just walk outside and see there's a lot more cars in the streets, and those cars tend to be bigger than cars in previous decades. And what that means is like there's less visibility for drivers to be able to actually see pedestrians, especially young kids. You can easily see that if you're driving a big vehicle like an SUV or a pickup truck, it's less likely you'll be able to see any pedestrian that is below 5 feet.
Hmm.
And it really, we want to make sure that people know when they're buying these vehicles that there's a higher chance of, if you were to be on a traffic crash, impact pedestrian or a cyclist, then the likelihood of dying is higher. And what we saw as well was that last year, um, out of the 29 cyclists that were killed, actually, I'll say 2019, out of the 29 cyclists that were killed, 25 of them involve a truck, a
Hmm.
bus, a SUV, or a van. These are large vehicles that are primarily that are involved in traffic crashes that result in fatalities for cyclists.
Right. Thank you for sharing, Erwin. And I understand that Transportation Alternatives has a few suggestions to make streets safer for cyclists and pedestrians. Can you share what hashtag NYC 25 by 25 is and how the community can advocate to improve street safety in streets like Westchester Avenue in the Bronx?
Yeah, so 25 by 25 is a challenge that we're giving out to every single person running for office in this election season. So we're asking them is, New York City as a whole, we cannot expand. We are a very dense, congested city,
Mm.
and this status quo doesn't work for the majority of New Yorkers. We all have been stuck in traffic. We all have been waiting like 10, 20, 30 minutes for a bus, especially in the Bronx. And as cyclists, we've been in situations where, like we may get hit by a car. And also, it's important to know that we have the solutions for all these problems. And the solution is to give the space back to people and reclaim it back from automobiles. So how do we do that? There's a lot of different ways that you can reclaim that space and give it back to people so that we have a just, equitable city. And that is, you can, as I mentioned, protected bike lanes, dedicated busways, space for trash containers so that our sidewalks are not congested, so there's more people that can walk and they're not forced to walk on the street. Um, and also open streets, streets that are open for everyone, so that both cars, people can commingle and cars can enter as an invited guests, but they don't get to dictate the rules of the street. That we can have our children and everyone in our community be able to use that street in front of their house as an extension of their front yard and get to meet neighbors and get to experience what New York is about, in a way that is safe for all.
So, kind of like what we've seen in the pandemic with the restaurants having open streets and kind of designated areas for these restaurants and businesses to allow people to just enjoy the street rather than having cars go through, right?
Exactly, and and with our report with 25 by 25, we actually looked at 5 different types of streets of
Mhm.
like how can you convert those streets into what would be a 25 by 25 street. And in the Bronx, we picked Worcester Avenue and Prospect Avenue. That intersection, as we all know, is a very busy intersection. It's an intersection that is the geometry is very difficult because it doesn't come at right angles. And you have about 5 to 6 different intersections, like that, like places there to cross,
Hmm.
and also is below the elevated train. So there's a lot of competition for space. And what we know of that space is that one is one of the hearts of the community of the South Bronx. There's a lot of mobile vendors, there's a lot of street vendors there, and there's a lot of pedestrians there. So
Right.
in order to be able to reclaim that space, we want to look at how can we give more space to the current use of that intersection, which is like street vendors and pedestrians and buses, and also what else can be done with this new added space. So it's a matter of having more space for people, not necessarily like having to eliminate all car lanes. You
Right.
can you can integrate that space so that the balance of public space. Streets are about 80% of the entire public space in the entire city. Yet, and pedestrians and cyclists and public transportation users are the majority of people that move around the city that use the street. Yet they have the least amount of space dedicated to them. So it's just like fixing that imbalance of how our streets is dedicated for.
Got it. Now, Erwin, I do want to have some time to talk about the Crash Victims' Rights and Safety Act. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and what it proposes? What are the bills within that Safety Act?
Yeah, so this is a package of bills that we're pushing up in Albany in order to save lives, bring restitution, and bring justice to people that are impacted by traffic violence, and also prevent dangerous behavior from drivers to take the lives of people. So it's about 8 bills, and I can talk about a little bit about all of them. One of them is called Sammy's Law, which is named after one of the members of Family for Safe Streets, which is one of our sister organizations that are there to provide support for anyone that has lost loved ones or been impacted by traffic violence. So Sammy's Law, what they would do is it would allow the New York City to determine the speed limits of every street. So right now, for any change of speed limits in New York City, we need to go to Albany and get authorization. And that means that the people that know best the streets in New York City don't get to decide how fast a car can go to. And if you have a street that, like you have a lot of speeding going through, you are not able right now to request your council member or even to request the mayor to change the speed limit. Another one is the Crash Victim Bill of Rights, which is to guarantee rights and voice for crash victims and their loved ones in legal proceedings. We also want to see speed cameras 24/7, which would allow New York City to have this life-saving technology be available 24/7. The Dangerous Driving Act to hold the most reckless drivers accountable and prevent future crashes. The vehicle safety rating and labeling, which I talked about a little bit earlier, to give people more information about the cars that they're buying and to think about the safety of others outside of their vehicles. Okay. Reducing the blood alcohol content limit for DWI from 0.08 to 0.05. The right to safe passage, which would require drivers to pass cyclists at a safe distance of at least 3 feet, and the DMV pre-licensing to educate New York drivers about safely interacting with vulnerable road users.
Thank you so much, Erwin, for your time. I wish we had more time, but before we go, I wanted to share that TA does have an upcoming event. We want to invite the Bronx to come out and join you for the Ghost Bike Memorial Ride. Can you just tell us when it's taking place and how people can join?
So we'll be having our 5th annual Transportation Alternatives Bronx Ghost Bike Memorial Ride. This will be happening Saturday, June 26th at 9:30 a.m. We'll meet up at Lou Gehrig Plaza, and we'll be traveling to all the ghost bikes that commemorate cyclists that have been killed in Bronx streets throughout the years, and to give a message to the elected officials that we need to end the fatalities in our streets that involve cyclists and pedestrians, and then we need infrastructure in order to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Erwin, for your time today. We'll be right back here on Open BX RX Tuesday.